One of the things that is noticeable if you're creative or innovative in any way at any point in history, and that is that there's enormous pressure to kill, to avoid developing, to starve that which is most beautiful, that which has the highest potential to connect, to bring well-being, to evolve the culture. And I wanted to take a look at why that is. So first of all, everything exists on a bell curve. Every human innovation goes through a period of not existing, then just existing, then for those scientific discoveries and technologies that offer a strong incentive based on the culture's current value hierarchy, certain things are adopted. And right after they're adopted and validated by a few leading individuals, then others get on and others get on. And eventually you reach the stage where the majority of people, or the majority of people in that field, meaning the current norm for the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, is never going to be adopted by the majority of people because the majority of people do not have a Large Hadron Collider. But what is adopted by the majority in a given in a given area, the majority fashion within a given country, within a given climate, the majority fabric used within a given area. The new technology that shows the most promise gradually gains prominence to where a majority of people, or a majority of people in that demographic, have adopted and are using that technology. By that time, there is a better technology, a more beautiful technology, something more elegant that has been discovered, has been developed, that is always being used by a minority. So that which is most beautiful is always on the bleeding edge, meaning beauty is on a gradient, and one of its distinctions is complexity. When you take something that's beautiful with a single thread count, and then you turn it into something that's beautiful with 1,000 thread count, you've increased the complexity. And in doing so, created a softer bed sheet, for example. But it's, as things develop, that sense that is human beauty, it's a little bit ineffable. It's something that we see that leads our imagination through a doorway, in many ways, into something that is not here. A lot of what is beautiful in the human experience is the teleportation of a part of consciousness, where we look at something and there's something about it that leads us to then extrapolate a more beautiful world in the future. You take modernism, which is the current fad within architecture, stainless steel clean lines. So you have, the Chanel-like look, the uniformed skin texture, the symmetrical lines of a graceful body. You have the clean lines of stainless steel, the clean white lines of concrete, etc. And the ideal that's being reached for through that image is an ideal where everything is clean, where everything has purpose, where everything is symmetrical, where everything is good enough. And what's being suppressed in that particular attractor towards that particular ideal is, for example, shame, the shame of inadequacy, the shame of our imperfections, the grief or the sorrow of what we cannot fix in the past. That's what's being marginalized, because the promise of perfect modernism is that if you have the latest iPad and you have the latest Windows and the latest remote, in the whole advertisement for modernism is not cost-benefit analysis. There isn't any. People spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars remodeling perfectly nice, cozy houses into more confrontational, bold, clean-lined modernism. And they're doing all that not because it's a good return on investment, not because it improves their quality of living directly. In many cases, it makes it more uncomfortable. But they're doing so with the idea that the person who lives in that house that looks like this, that has this body, doesn't have any flaws, which is an important mask in a culture that's filled with shame. And so one of the real goals in the clean simplicity of modernism, in the stark exteriors that we pretend has an industrial look, but it's an industrial look that's being fabricated. It's not like it's turning a factory into lofts, which is how this particular phase began when it was practical. Now we import bizarre modern artifacts from around the globe to look modern, to look clean, to look with it. And of course, the person who will pay the most money for that look is someone who does not want to be associated with old-fashioned, with being backward, with having flaws. So there's a cultural selling. But what is emerging, what is most beautiful, is always in a minority position. It is the suggestion of what could be in all of its beautiful possibility. And the question is, why does that get crushed so extensively within almost every culture throughout time? And to understand that, we have to look at the human brain in its evolution from reptilian crocodiles 200 million years ago to the current visionary thinking. And it's not just the current, the visionary thinking of the frontal lobes, of the transcendent states induced, some suspect, by the endogenous DMT in the pineal gland. That sense of music, that's the synesthesia where the masculine and the feminine polarities within each body come together and spark a third energy, an explosion of dimensionality that is much bigger than 1 + 1. It is a synergy. It's 1 multiplied by 1, creating 1,000. Just add zeros. It's incredibly potential, or potentiated, the synergy of the masculine and feminine, the synergy of the right and the left brain, the synergy of the lineal structured mathematics and the wave formation and the image formation and the emotional tone. The heart perceives reality through the feminine measuring device, a scientific measurement called the human heart. The mind, the brain, perceives the same reality through its digitized, through its particle form. The wave form and the particle form together form more than either one alone. Now, if we understand that depending on what part of our brain we most identify with, determines whether we identify primarily as sociopathic reptiles in the reptilian brain with fight, flight, freeze, survival instincts. I will do whatever I need to survive physically and emotionally in a world that I don't trust, that I don't feel safe in. So this is a reptilian fight, flight, freeze. Now, when you're in the fight, flight, freeze reptilian traumatic brain, or when you're in the mammalian emotional brain, where you just have emotions that are not integrated with vision and values and thoughts, they're just going to explode, and they're often very crude, just I want that, or I want to fuck that person, or get away from me, or I want to kill you. There's this emotion, but it's not tempered. It's the animal area of the brain. So you have the cold-blooded, no emotion. And then you have the hot-blooded, emotion without regulation. And then you get emotion with regulation. And then you move into the transcendent arenas of the brain. So you've got 4 basic arenas of consciousness. Now, these are not, every human being is born, or at least 99.9% of human beings are born, with the capacity to navigate their consciousness and identify with any one of those primary brain areas. The more traumatized an individual is, the more traumatizing an individual's environment is. Meaning trauma doesn't come out of nowhere. If an individual is traumatized, it is a direct correlation with being in a traumatic environment. Traumatized people are produced by traumatizing environments, in other words. And traumatized people in a traumatizing environment do not have that trauma fully as resolved, meaning the majority of Americans are traumatized and are trauma illiterate in a traumatizing environment. So you have 3 variables that are all pushing towards the reptilian brain, the fight, flight, freeze, sociopathic, strategic brain, rather than the empathic and compassionate brain. Now, every human being can be induced into any one. So you really are learning about the safety and intelligence of the environment by the emotional health of the people, and the mental health as well. They go hand in hand. The healthier an environment is, the more empathic the people are. The more empathic the people are, the more they are focused on their curiosity, on their generosity, on their kindness, on their empathy, and on helping those that are out there. You've got a bit of pain going on here. Let me take this out. There's a wonderful fairy tale about the little girl that took the thorn out of the dog sent by the witch to attack the little girl, and then the dog wouldn't attack the little girl, and she bound the wound up. And there's this is a metaphor for when we are surrounded by people who even our sociopathic parts may want to hurt, or is not, our sociopathic brain is focusing on what we want and is ignoring their needs, etc. And so there's a likelihood of stepping on someone's toes, of insulting them, of not providing a nurturing environment. But when someone enters kindly and innocently to take some of the stress, some of the grief, some of the panic and trauma out of our world, we naturally move more into our empathic brain around that person. and having moved more into our empathic brain around that person, we then protect that person like we protect ourselves. That's the power of empathy, is the mirror neurons of empathy say, well, how can I take care of you? Now, the more traumatized a culture is, the more frightened a culture is of the unknown. Because trauma is that human state that measures. Trauma is a physiological, mental, and emotional response that works under the presumption that life, or life as we know it, is threatened, and that it's too big for me to deal with alone. And so the only thing that I can do to respond is to stay in the terrain that I feel safe, which is terrain that is familiar. Now, everything that is beautiful, that is most beautiful, that is on that bleeding edge coming in, is unfamiliar. The more traumatized a culture is, the more frightened of the unknown a culture is, because the unknown is neutral. 99.9% of everything that exists and ever will exist is unknown. And most of that is unknown, meaning we don't even know that we don't know it. That's how big the unknown is. That's a very big field. And within the unknown and the unknown are absolute horrific tragedies that we lack the imagination, the humility to prepare for and understand. There are traumas within the unknown. But there are also miracles. There are also transcendent gifts. There are things like cell phone technology, which to any 15th century country anywhere in the world is a miracle. People talking to people who are invisible via outer space satellites, that's the realm of miracles and gods and goddesses. Well, those technologies that are 100 times more interesting, 100 times more beautiful than cell phones, they wait in the unknown and in the unknown. As do the traumas, as do the horrors that our culture can and will face. Now, when the bias in childhood is trauma and unresolved trauma, the fear of the unknown is paramount, because it may take people back into the terrain in which they feel helpless and traumatized. So the unknown is the enemy. When the unknown is the enemy, the minorities in a culture will always be the enemy. So, talk about homosexuality. Why is it the enemy? I mean, we can't say that the planet doesn't have enough people. Go forth and multiply. We need 20 billion people because we haven't destroyed it enough with 10. We can't say that. There's no logical reason to be afraid of a new or a very ancient technology of relationship that does not create as many children. And yet we are terrified of it. And so you can gauge the trauma level and the unresolved trauma level, and thus the health of a culture, by how frightened it is of the unknown. We can engage the fear of the unknown by the way minorities are treated, the very old, the very young, the sick, the disabled, people without a voice. These minorities, highly creative people, geniuses, these minorities represent the edge of the unknown. minorities represent a position within the culture that is unknown to the majority. And so there's a tension. Well, there's two forms of tension as the minority interacts with the majority. The first form of tension is the unknown. And that's the knee-jerk reaction that anytime someone says something that is so far outside of the framework of another person that they realize they don't even have the skill to have the conversation, that's a threatening place for someone who's scared of the unknown. So if you bring up a topic where the paradigm is not understood, the value hierarchy that leads to the paradigm is not understood, the technology basis, the basis for developing the technology is not understood because the paradigm and the value hierarchy is not understood. And then the technology itself is not understood by the majority because that's not the leaning that the majority paradigm would lean us towards. So it's not familiar, and it bucks. It says that the current majority paradigm is incomplete. It has a blind spot. It's left some stuff out. This is destabilizing. It's unsettling for the majority. So this is the first kind of resistance, is the trauma of the unknown and the unsettlement. The other one is very similar, but it's about efficiency as opposed to trauma. Now, take electric cars. They are superior. They make less noise. They smell better. They drive better. They accelerate faster. They're cheaper to operate. Electric cars are the most intelligent form of transportation to date. And they've been a new technology, with gas cars and diesel cars being the majority. Now, why isn't everyone driving an electric car once this became obvious in, 30 years ago? Why isn't everyone driving an electric car when Edison was all for the electric car? I mean, what? And a lot of it is when the majority swing a certain way, in this case towards gas, there's lots of infrastructure that with lots of gas stations and stuff. So there's an enormous amount of energy to maintain the status quo, because it will take a lot of energy to turn all the gas stations into electric stations. And in fact, the electric station doesn't work quite as well because people prefer, electricity being ubiquitous, people prefer to have electric stations at their favorite restaurants, at their shops, and just park, while they're anywhere they park, they'd rather have an electric cord there as opposed to having to sit around in a gas station like the current model. And so there's so much improvement in that model, but it takes a transformation of the system. And so the bleeding edge idea and what is good for the minority always requires a large infrastructure transformation. And this is inefficient in the short term. And so there's a resistance until the gap gets to be enormous, until it's so much better. And often people say in the innovative industry that your idea needs to be 10 times better than the existing thing, or the amount of hassle it takes to change isn't going to be worth the person. They're going to basically think in their mind, I don't have time to update my whole phone and software system and contacts and all that. So even if it's 10% faster, it's just not worth my effort. But if it's 10 times faster, if I can come to you and say, here's a phone that is literally 10 times faster, you can download a week's worth of movies in 10 minutes, go offline, you can watch broadband anywhere, this and that, the other, you can video conference, you can do virtual, it's 10 times faster, then people will make the shift. Now, you and I, coming up with new ideas, parts of ourselves, there are new personas that are superior to the dominant personas in the culture. There are new communication technologies that are superior to the dominant communication technologies. There are new education platforms that are superior to the majority of our education platforms. And they are all being marginalized and actively resisted, despite their superiority, because the individuals involved do not want to go through asking all of the stakeholders in a current system to face their fears of the unknown and end up, and examine and think. You have to think. This is the other friction point. When you just do what the majority is doing, you don't have to think, and you're not going to be blamed for your stupidity. Meaning you will be stupid, but you'll be stupid along with a majority of people. So they can't blame you because they're stupid themselves. So when you fall into a majority pattern, it's the one thing you can do without thinking. As soon as you're in a minority pattern, you have to have consciously analyzed and taken responsibility for making a choice that's different than the majority of people are making in your field, in that area, in that culture. So if the majority of people are heterosexual and you're homosexual, bisexual, etc., you have to think about that. What does it mean? Why? You have to do that. The person that's in a 90% heterosexual culture and has heterosexual sex doesn't have to do any thinking. In a culture where 90% of people have children, the person who has a child doesn't have to do any thinking. But the person that says, no, I don't want to have a child because of this, and this, that's a thought. That's a series of thoughts. And so it takes more work on a mental consciousness level to be a contrarian. And once you're a contrarian, it does not mean you will succeed. Because, for example, the first and best electric car company that doesn't have an electric charging infrastructure all the way around the world may not be welcomed, not because their idea isn't vastly superior to gasoline and diesel cars, but because country. And so they can't, so they don't. People don't buy the car, even though it's better. A similar situation at various points in software and technology evolution, where it's been known for a long time that Microsoft Windows is a terrible operating system relative to some of its alternatives. The trouble is that the amount of scale, the amount of monopoly position that it established early on and managed to maintain through a variety of interesting negotiating approaches was such that all the different software companies that had built on that platform, they didn't all want to double their work for someone to have a twice as good operating system. Having an operating system that's twice as good as Windows is so easy. But asking the 80% of the business world that has designed their software to launch off of a crappy user interface called Windows is an enormous undertaking, and they don't want to do it. So you have to use crappy Windows to accommodate the fact that billions and billions and billions in software that launches on the Windows OS operating system doesn't have to all get redesigned, basically. So that's the friction. So you have, I don't want to think and be responsible. We'll just do what the majority wants. I don't want to reinvent the wheel for something that's just twice as good. That's, another factor. And then we have fear of the unknown and the bias towards the negative that occurs within the human brain when we are trauma illiterate and have not healed and resolved our childhood traumas, abuses, and pains.